All right. So the way this kind of got started was I was polling some of our class members to get some ideas on who they would like to hear. And Mel Steiner had introduced the idea of Kathy Narramore sharing her testimony with us. Many of you know Kathy, and of course, she was part of Whittier area staff for about 15 years as the missions pastor. And since that time, she has continued to keep her hand in missions work, continuing to participate in member care with the Narramore Christian Foundation for Chinese missionaries, including some American Chinese missionaries in Hong Kong. And so this just seemed like a subject that was particularly good to hear about right now at this point in time. So Kathy, we want to thank you for being with us. And I would like to just pray for you in this moment to get us started. Our Heavenly Father, we just thank you for allowing this gathering and for keeping us close to yourself. We just pray, Lord, this morning that you would be particularly with Kathy and for those lessons that we need to hear about how you lead, how we know that your presence is with us. We just pray, Lord, that you would allow us to see those things in her testimony. We ask these things in your precious name. Amen.
All right, Kathy, are you there?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. You know what? I just want to say one thing, that there is such an interesting connection between Eduardo and his wife Patty and another member of our church. And that is Eddie Sousa, who we love because he leads our worship, right? At WAC for the Heritage Service, Eddie Saloka. His parents and Philip know Eduardo and Patty from another world like theirs. He was part of the space program and remembers you somehow. I don't know how, but I just thought, well, that's a small world. And I'm working quite closely with him now. I hope we'll get back to that. Anyway, I'm grateful for them. And then I want to pick up on Mel Steiner. It's fun. You know, there's some rewards for being old, yes? And one of them is memories. You can think way back. Mel Steiner had a mutual friend with me. Her name was Marilyn Wilcoxon. And Marilyn and Mel decided that they would do a seminar for mothers. This is back in the 70s. And so they did here in Hacienda Heights. I was a young struggling mother, and I was trying to find all I could in the Bible and all I could from the psychological standpoint, and then put them together. And so partly inspired by her and encouraged, I started a seminar for mothers, a training, teaching for mothers at the home of the pastor's wife for Whittier Hills Baptist Church. And out of that, we needed some homework, and my husband obliged to help us with homework for mothers. And out of that came a book called Help, I'm a Parent, because that's how we felt. And I think it's sold now about 200,000 copies and has been translated into many other languages. So the history with this class is quite special. Because of that book, Bruce was then invited to speak on the subject of parenting to a young group of people that had formed a new church They met on Cole Road. And the name of their church was Whittier Area Baptist Fellowship. So that's a pretty important connection, yes, because that's how we even found out they existed. So I am very happy to be invited to speak, and I'm hoping that there'll be a contribution in this interruption, Eduardo, and not a distraction. I hope the Lord will use it toward this wonderful series on the King and the Kingdom. Yes. So another person I want to mention is Sam and Glenna Holloway. Sam was an elder when I was asked to start the missions program at WAC. And I was quite reluctant about it, actually, but he was very encouraging. And so he got to go through with me the big challenge of what I be called director of missions or pastor of missions. And that was a big deal. I don't know if any of you remember that, but it was a big deal. But he felt that if we were going to pastor missionaries, we should be called pastors. So that's how it was. Today I've been asked about my relationship to China because it's been a little bit in the news. And we could start with that picture, Ed, of me at the church. You had it up there though, I think. Yeah. And I don't know if you can, yeah, there we are. So this is Debbie on the left and Richard on the other side and Bruce. And that's where they grew up and was in this church. And so it's so important to us and to our history. And Debbie is now teaching at Cornerstone University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, because she was invited to join Don Perini. I don't know if any of you there remember the Perinis. And he was a youth pastor. She was working as a youth pastor at Whittier Area Community Church, and then went there, and he invited her to teach a course he just introduced on creativity, and now it's a major, and so she and he are doing that together, and their roots were here at WAC. All right, now, about China. I was born in Peking, China, and I always say that I was predestined to be born there because my maiden name was Rice, R-I-C-E. And when I was born, the title of this is going to be really around dangers and losses. And my desire would be this, that as we journey through a couple of these, some of these early years for me, that you would think about journeying with me and what you've learned and what I could learn too about the character of God in all this and his ways, and then share them at the end during the Q&A, maybe jot them down or whatever, and I think it would bless all of us. So being born in Peking, it was an occupied city by the Japanese when I arrived. And the night I arrived, both my mother and I nearly died. We nearly, 36 hours of labor for my mother, and it was too much. So my father went into the doctor's room because she was spending the night there and said, 3 a.m. in the morning, you must perform a cesarean, please, you must. So she did, and we survived, but she was very concerned because she'd lost another mother. But guess why it really happened? Because two friends of my mother, two wonderful women, were praying all night for us. And I really believe that's the real reason that we survived. So already starting off with some dangers, right, in Beijing. And then World War II, my father could see it was coming on the horizon. And it's only 2.5 years later. and what to do, because the mission policy was you could not leave your post. You had to stay where you were. But my father looked at this little 2.5-year-old girl and he thought, I don't want her to have to go through prison camp. I just want my wife to take her home. But my mother didn't want to leave my father in such circumstances. And so he booked her 5 times on different ships, and she canceled 5 times on different ships because she didn't want to leave him. Finally, she saw that emotionally he couldn't take it. So she said, okay. So on the 6th try, what was left was a Japanese ship in Kobe. And so he took us there to Kobe from China. And they could see tankers all camouflaged, ready for Pearl Harbor, which of course they didn't know about then. And there was all the whispering going on, and you knew war was coming. So in their 20s, they said goodbye to each other, not knowing what would be ahead, not knowing if they would ever see each other again. If we got into war with Japan on the way home, she and I would immediately go to concentration camp. My father could be taken there. So the unknowns were pretty amazing. And that's how they parted. And my mother said it was a Japanese passenger ship that was twice overloaded, and the railings were, not made for a 2.5-year-old. So she said she walked me across the Pacific, basically. And also I had to learn English on this trip because my first language was Chinese. I had a Chinese ama, a nurse maid, and nanny that took care of me. And so I couldn't speak English. And my grandfather said, do not bring a Chinese granddaughter home that can't speak English to me. So you have to learn English. I also had to learn how to chew gum and how to eat ice cream. So that was my big orientation coming home. When we got back to Los Angeles, where the headquarters were of our mission, my mother walked into the small church there in Hollywood, and a leader of the mission, OMS, Oriental Missionary Society at the time, was speaking. And he was speaking about people that left their post. And he had no idea of the suffering my mother had just gone through. So this will be mostly about my parents. They're my heroes, really. And the thing about my mother is that instead of being super upset and angry and fighting for her rights and ways and apology and all that, she made a friend of this man. His name was Mr. Culver. And you'll find he comes back into my story later in an incredibly important place. So we come home, and it was Christmas when we arrived around that time. So mother read me a Christmas story. Okay, I'm 2.5, and I'm asking her where Jesus is. And she thought, oh, this is a good opportunity. So she said, well, he's in heaven, but he can be in your heart if you ask him in. So I bowed my head and I asked Jesus to come in my heart. And so then when I finished, she said, Kathleen, what did Jesus say to you? And I thought, and I said, he told me not to stamp my feet and say, darn it. So that was my great conversion, but it did hold. And, because of her model, that she didn't think that was unreasonable, or she took it seriously, I was able to lead my Debbie to the Lord Jesus right here in Stimson Park when she was 3. And it really lasted. And then I had the great honor and privilege of leading my granddaughter, her daughter, to the Lord Jesus, talking about my mother, actually, who had passed away, and I was taking her to tea, and she was 3. It was right there in downtown Whittier. So those were wonderful rewards that came from the model of my mom. My mother was in Hollywood. My father was in Peking. He nearly died during this time of typhus. And because of that, the mission said, okay, you can come home. So he toured Pearl Harbor in September and then heard December 7th in the Midwest that it was bombed. So it was very close. But my daddy, therefore, was with us all during the war years in Indiana, in pastoring different churches, small rural churches. And, you know, it was a very happy time for me. It was a very upbeat time for me. And in this period of time, my mom had a baby boy. And we had moved to Indiana, to this little rural town, and he was, I think we were there for about a month or two, and he was near a year. Very happy, beautiful baby, I remember. And 4 days before his first birthday, she put him to bed, and in the morning, he wasn't there. He had died from a SIDS death. And I remember, I wasn't at the funeral, but I remember hearing that my mother sang at the funeral of that baby boy, "No one ever cared for me like Jesus." And that made quite an impression on me. So all the 5 years of the war we spent in Indiana. And during the end of that time, another son was born. Now it's 1946, and if you want to see my brother and I going across the Pacific, there we are already in December again, which is very stormy. This is a converted troop ship, the first ship that would take women and children back to China. So we had 20 women and girls in my cabin, and my dad and my little brother had 20 men and boys crowded into their cabin. And it was quite a ride, because when we'd be eating our meals, it was very stormy, and we weren't first class, second class, third class. We were emergency third class, sitting at picnic tables, and then our dishes would go down and crash on the floor when the ship rolled. So, you know, but all during this time, my parents felt called by God to go back, and I never picked up their anxiety. I had a wonderful time as a little kid, and I just didn't feel a loss of peace. That I felt was a real gift to me. And so it was my birthday. I was turning 8 years old. We just kind of begun the trip, and the chef kindly made a birthday cake for me with 8 candles on it. And I was just getting ready to literally blow them out when everything went black and dark. Couldn't hear anything, couldn't see anything. And what happened is that the motors on the boat stopped. And because the motors stopped, the pumps wouldn't work. So water began to come in, you know, at the bottom, and suitcases began to float around. So we were sinking, basically. And then 14 hours later, somehow they got the engine started, and we were on our way. However, on our way, we came within 20 feet of a floating bomb, because it was still right after World War II, yes? And our captain said he could have thrown a rope to it. It was that close. And there was absolutely nothing he could do about it either. So guess what we discovered during this time? You know the man that my mother made a friend of, who had told her people that leave their post? She made a friend of him. He was in Winona Lake, Indiana at this time, and he was taking out the trash. It was very cold. And as he was taking out the trash, he saw the four of us, the four of our family, with our hands up going down under the water. And he threw down the trash and he just said, "Lord, save the rices." And that was his prayer. But when we checked, we found out it was right during that time. So that has always made a big impression on me. So then we finally arrive in first Qingdao. We take another ship, and then we go to Tianjin. I don't know if you can catch that on the map. And we get a train. It's cold. There's no heating. We sit on the train, and it doesn't move. And so we sit there all day. I'm 8 years old, and by now I have little brother Eddie, and he's see, he would be around three, I guess. And nothing happened. So finally they said, "All right, go back to your hotel and come back in the morning." So we did. And then we finally began to inch our way out. And we got into desert area, very barren, and we're just going very slowly. And then we find out that 500 had been killed over those tracks the day before. That's why we weren't moving, between the nationalists and the communists fighting over those tracks. Welcome to peaceful 6 years in Beijing, yes? So I have to just mention the fact that we really loved, however, our place that we lived. Can you see where Beijing is? Right here, can you see? I don't know, you can't, that won't help, but there it is. Yeah, he's pointing to it right there. And then Tianjin is just down. Can you see just below it? Tianjin to the right, I think. But in any case, we had to take this train, and then we landed in Beijing. And then if you can show a picture of the four of us, my brother and I, and we're standing on our compound, and there we are. And it was a former Duke's palace, and it was right near the Forbidden City. It came on the market cheap, and they wanted to use it for a Bible training seminary. And so they bought it. Can you see the covered walk? There's our church. And then see the covered walk. When I go to the Huntington Library, to the Chinese garden, I'm home. This is what it looks like. This is how it's supposed to be, you know? And in the winter, I learned to ice skate in the Winter Palace. In the summer, I learned to swim around the marble boat in the Summer Palace, which they have sort of a symbol of this in the Huntington Gardens now, actually. And we were also so blessed to have guests that would come from the US. And one of them was named Bob Pierce. He was founder of World Vision, doing his first Youth for Christ rally. Another was Dawson Trotman, who was founder of Navigators, coming out to do Youth for Christ ministry to thousands of young Chinese. Very timely because of what happened soon after that. Now I'm 10 years old, and I'm watching soldiers go down in front of my big red gates, all camouflaged in their Jeeps, going to fight the communists. And I hear a lot of bombing on the outside of the city, about for a month. Finally, the missionaries are told by the American consulate they have to get out. It's just too dangerous. I remember singing in Sunday services in the Chinese church with my dad. And I would sing, "Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus." And I was going to get on a plane and get out, but they weren't. And that really made an impression on me too. Because we would hear terrible stories of atrocities of our pastors being tortured and put in prison just because they were Christians. And so we had to leave, but it was very difficult. I was leaving my family and my home. But I would like to show you a picture of the airplane that we got, because it was the last plane out of Beijing, and it was a prop plane, 2 engines. There we are loading. I'm actually over on the far left. I don't know if you can see this little girl with a camera Shannon hat on. My mom is there in front of us. So whatever we could take, we're going to load into that plane. And so we take off with those 2 props. And you know what? Halfway to Shanghai, the pilot says, guess what? We're overloaded. So you're going to have to make a decision. You'll have to toss out a whole lot of all your stuff, or go back, or pray and keep it. Oh, the missionary said, we're going to pray and keep it. So we landed in Shanghai on 1 motor, but they had all their stuff with them. And so we're thinking, well, okay, we're going down to Canton. If you look on the map, that's the southernmost part of the map, of down here, Guangzhou. There you go, just above Guangzhou is Canton. Yep, right there. And so we see Beijing clear down here to Guangzhou. We're down there, and do you know that in 6 months, they were already down there. They had already come down that big country and were ready at our door, and we had to leave again. But I want to go back to why there was so much peace and acceptance of this, again, from my parents. So I didn't feel their anxiety and terrible fear and so on. My mother would have, back in Beijing, 4 o'clock coffee hours for the missionaries. And they would come and, you know, share and pray and have a great time. And as we were getting near the evacuation, a young missionary sat down at the piano. And I remember this, I'm 10, right? And he sang and played, placing my all in his hands, I will fear not. He knoweth best, though I don't understand. I choose his will, whate'er it may cost me. I will obey his every command. That was the source of peace for my parents, and the lack of fear. That was another great gift they gave me. And so then here comes the communists. The Long March was ended. When we left Beijing in 1948, less than a year later, that became the capital of Mao Zedong's People's Republic of China. And that began one of the most murderous times for, he just murdered millions. It was so awful. And even today, you know, Zhou Enlai came on the scene, and so there was a lot of material wealth. They became very wealthy. It was a whole different China than when we went, I can assure you, in the late 30s. But there's so much misery, and there's so little freedom, and the Christians continue to be persecuted. So back to Canton, we're there just a little while, but I do remember going to school. I'm 10, I'm going to school. And how did I get to school? I got on a pedicab that was driven by a Chinese, and then I was taken to the river, and I got a boat on the river, and then that took me to school. And on this boat that was owned by a family who lived there, and that was their business, I remember the dried rats hanging from the top there, which would be some of the things that they would be able to eat. But it made quite an impression on me. So I would say that I grieved because I lost my country when I left there. And yet the Lord gave me a transition gift. And you know what it was? One of my prayer partners for many years now has been a Mary Shao. When I was 1 year old in Peking, Mary Shao was 5, and she used to carry me on her back. Our parents were good friends, and so we used to get together and have fun times. But when the communists came and the Cultural Revolution began, her father was put in a concentration camp and starved to death. And his crime was because he was a Christian and he was also a scholar. Her husband was a famous physicist, even in that day, and he was put in concentration camp, and he was taking dynamite to blow up some of the mountains that they were commissioned to do, and he was blown up. So she's lost her father and her husband, and her brother was put in solitary confinement in a shower stall of the university he should have been a student in. A brilliant family. And someday I'd love to tell you more. They have been such an inspiration to me. This grandson, her grandson was put in a bedroom with her as a prisoner in her own house. And then he was sent to the rock pile at 14 to just no hope of ever getting off of it. Again, he could get off, he could get a great education if he would deny that he knew Jesus, and if he would say, I will not go against, I will go against my family. He wouldn't do it. So he went to the rock pile and he was told he'll be there forever. But do you know what? He was able to get off 3 years later. He told us this story, driving us to a very elegant restaurant he was going to pay for here in California, in LA. And he said it was my grandmother's response to this terrible persecution and rejection she always had that I began to realize this anger that I had about being on this rock pile was really my own war. And I needed to find that peace that my grandmother had. And I surrendered to Jesus. And it made all the difference. And I can assure you, he lives in Silicon Valley. He's invented all kinds of things for his own company and other companies. And God has rewarded and made it up to him in amazing ways. All right, well, let's see. We've got to stop here. So I just want to know if any of you have thoughts about what you could learn about the character of God and his ways as you have listened to this story. Can you talk?
Right. As Kathy is Jeannie Gordon, I just sense throughout your entire story and your life as I've known you as God is faithful. And you also have really been a truly servant of the Lord and faithful. So I thank God for you.
God's character and his ways that
One of the things that occurred to me as you were talking about evacuation and you know, twice, you know, you guys had to leave. What a difficult thing that would have been to your parents who have been nurturing and helping people as missionaries, natives there. And it just made me recall how Paul, you know, especially with the church in Corinth, he had this longing to be with them, and he was so worried about their well-being because they knew, for, you know, in their own context. They were under attack from Satan. And so maybe can you share a little bit about how they managed that? I mean, because I imagine there was a little bit of guilt too, right? That, hey, I'm leaving these folks behind.
Absolutely, survivor's guilt. And I've carried that for a long time in my life.
Yeah.
Because I was able to get out, they couldn't. You know, they just had to find the peace and stability and character to move on and be, and not they wasn't just barely getting by, but honestly there was abundance with it. They had, especially my mother, with the loss of that baby, that just was an earthquake for our whole family, truly. Like, I went to the mission field to serve you and this is my reward. That was the first response.
You know, you talked, honey, you know, you talked to us, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, about 3 different times that the Lord saved your life as well as others. And I'm sure there's been more than that, but in the boat, in the plane, in the birth, all of these times that God put his hand specifically on your family to keep you alive. So God has truly used you in a mighty way.
Yeah. I honestly hadn't thought about that. So thank you.
Yeah, I think the other thing that struck me about your story, Kathy, is in terms of God's ways is his sovereignty and how we have to bow to it. You know, we make our plans, you know, like your parents made a plan, we're going to be missionaries in China, and they probably had a long-term plan, and God changed it. And he changed it through circumstances that seem really unfair, right? I mean, the whole communism takeover. And yet, that's the way God works. And that's the way he's made the church in China flourish. So that struck me as well.
Yes, yes. The church in China are really my heroes because they have learned so much from martyrdom and so on. You know, the place that we went next, which is another story, I promise not to get into it now, but we had a 6-year term, and so we had 3 more years. We couldn't go home. We had to stay on the mission field, and it couldn't be China. So we had to go to Tokyo, Japan. And that was where we ended up. And I won't say more about that except this, and that is that my mother did not really have a lot of love in her heart for the Japanese, having gone through what we did. Yes?
Right.
And my little brother nearly died on the way there. He got a bad typhus shot, and it was like getting typhus, and he nearly died as a little boy, baby. So the minute they arrived in Tokyo, they put him in a Seventh-day Adventist hospital, and they tried to help him survive. And it wasn't working, and my mother and dad went out to get a cup of coffee and came back. And there were 7 Japanese nurses kneeling around his bed praying for him. And that changed her attitude. And one of the most fruitful years of my father's missionary life was in Tokyo. And I'd love to tell you another time about Dr. Talbot, who came to his missionaries to comfort and encourage them, and how he'd just come from an interview with a General Douglas MacArthur. Imagine that. And so, you know, I just want to tell you, when I look back on my life, it's full of richness, of adventure. I wouldn't trade anything for it. And it's all because of the abundance in, you know, the good times and the bad that the Lord can bring. So
Kathy, this is Joyce. Did you, beautiful, wonderful testimony. Did you ever go back to China after all this?
Yes, I got to go back when my mother led a tour. So I got to be with her, and she was a missionary from the Church of the Open Door, and so we went back with a pastor from there. And then another time I went back as my own, as a missions pastor. So I got to visit some of our missionaries there, and it was such a change, though. You know, the only thing that was the same, we found the same back alley. And I found the church, actually, that you saw, it was turned into a restaurant. And
Oh,
we sat down and ate there. And, you know, a young couple heard that I had grown up there. And she said, you know, I think there's a history of this place. And I want to go find it for you. And she went all around this place that used to be our warehouse and our church. And she found laminated a history of the place. And there was my Uncle Harry Woods, and there was my Uncle Ed Kilgore. And it was like a story of my family. And it made such a difference. It really did. Well, I would love to go on. And my doctor, Dr. K.T. Lin, who I heard about from a Whittier College Chinese graduate student who was from Beijing, 7 generations of doctors. Oh, yes, we know about Dr. K.T. Lin. She's Russian. That means she has a fire in her heart. She loves Jesus, and he was a red communist. So what a testimony that I got from them. Oh, there's so many, but I'm going to stop.